So yesterday we talked about plant hormones, and we have just a little bit more to talk about that to finish up that topic. When plants, the way they behave, we call that a tropism. And we learned yesterday that the way they grow is dependent upon that growth hormone that we talked about. So growth is a response to this hormonal action. If you cut off the growing part of a plant, it just stops growing in that part. If that's the only part that it has on the plant, it just won't grow anymore. But like if, for instance, if you have a tree and you prune the tree in certain places, you stop its growth in that area, and then often it will let out. So if you want the tree to be fuller, you'll cut off the part that's growing to make it long and spindly, and cut off that, and then it will usually bush out from there. The growth hormones aren't going to make the end grow anymore, they'll make it grow someplace else. So we have that. Now, how they respond to different stimuli is depending on what the stimulus is and what part of the plant we're talking about. So, for instance, if we're talking about phototropism, photo means what? Just that much of the word. What does photo mean? Like photograph, a graph is an image, but it's made using light, right? You make a photograph using light. So phototropism here is its response to light. And we know, for instance, like in this plant, what does that kind of indicates probably happening? You have a plant growing on a counter, a table, or something like that. Why is it growing sideways? It's growing towards the light. So there's probably a window off to the left in this picture, and it's growing toward the light. So that would be a positive tropism. The stems and the leaves are attracted toward the light. But what do roots do? What do roots do? They grow toward the light? No, they actually grow away from the light. So that would be a negative tropism for that. So light, they respond just the opposite. So roots grow into the soil, not out of the soil looking for light. Okay, another kind of tropism or response is gravitropism. That probably has something to do with what? Has something to do with gravity, right? Now, what do plants, how do they respond to gravity? They grow toward gravity, or the part that you see. Do they grow toward gravity or away from it? They grow away from it. They would grow up, right? So the stems and the leaves would have a negative tropism. They grow away from that stimulus. In fact, they're kind of trying to show that in this picture right here. If I turn the root sideways, what does it do? It bends and goes down because roots have positive tropism. So even though they've grown to a certain point, when the stimulus changes, they will then respond to that. The stem, here they took a seed and put it upside down. It grows up like this and then heads back toward gravity. So they will do whatever to respond properly to that. Stems will go up. If I were to, well, maybe not that plant, but let's say you had a nice plant growing, it was already this tall, and let's say the pot got knocked over on its side and nobody caught it. Well, what do you think is going to happen? Well, light is usually going to be up, so the ends where the growth is taking place will start growing and it'll start heading back up. So the part that's already grown will be sideways, but the new part will bend and go up away from gravity. If you were to look at what's happening to the roots underneath the soil, they were growing down, but now it's tipped over on the side. So those are horizontal, and they will then all the new roots will grow downward towards gravity. So roots have positive tropism for gravity. Stems have a negative tropism for gravity. We've already talked about this one, and we talked about the mimosa plant that I was, where if you touch it. So thigmotropism is a response to a touch, and the leaves will curl up. It's not permanent, remember. They will, after a period of time, these little leaflets will spread out and look like this again. So it's not, a permanent. Tropisms aren't necessarily permanent. If the stimulus changes, they change with it. Okay, chemotropism. If I were to have a plant, let's say it's growing here, and I put, let's say, fertilizer on just one side of the tree, what do you think the roots will do? They'll actually start growing toward the fertilizer. But what if there is a chemical in the soil that is harmful to the roots? What do you think they'll probably do? They'll grow away from that. So they will respond to chemicals, either toward it, if this is desirable, and if it's not desirable, they'll grow away from it. So plants respond. It's kind of a slow response. It's not like what we do. If I touch you, you immediately know that I touched you, but plants, their response is by the way they grow and things like that. Now, what are some factors that affect plants? Well, we know that one of the things that affects plants and how they behave and how they blossom and things like that has to do with how much light they have. And the amount of light that plants require is different. Some of them can't grow in, full bright sun. They can only grow where the light is kind of filtered, like under a tree. In other words, you might find them growing on a forest floor where the trees are blocking a large part of the light. Okay? Then there's others, you put them there and they won't do well at all. They'll get real tall and spindly. What are they trying to do? They're trying to grow as fast and as far as they can to get above whatever's blocking their light. So plants behave differently, depends on what their God-created light needs are. And which direction is the light? And then also the length of time that light is available. Like you might have some plants at your house that your mom or dad has planted on the east side, so it's only going to get morning sun. Well, it needs to be a plant that thrives in only morning sun. Not every plant will do that. A plant that needs full day sun is not going to do well there. It doesn't mean they'll die, they just don't want to do well. Remember this optimal range that we talked about earlier in the year? And then there's the range where, well, they can tolerate this, but they won't do well. Well, plants have these same needs as well. So here's an example of two pots that they planted seeds in. This is a pot where the seeds sprouted and they were exposed to sunlight. This one over here is a pot that was probably grown in the dark, it looks like. And the seeds sprouted and they grew the parts they needed, but they were looking for light. They're going to be tall and spindly. They're often going to be pale green, all the way to just plain white, if they've never had any light. Sometimes you see this happening if you have maybe like a deck and you have dirt underneath your deck and some seeds sprout underneath there. The plant might grow up and there's a little bit of light between the cracks in the boards, and it will grow up trying to find that light. And sometimes they'll have enough energy to be able to grow all the way through that crack. And then once they're above the crack, then they can spread their leaves out and they can get all the sunlight they need. But up till then, they're going to look really whitish looking because they're getting very little sunlight, and they're doing their best to get to where there is sunlight. But sometimes they run out of energy and they just die. I can't get through that crack. It's too far away. Now, some of the plants respond to, I'll just leave that for later. Some of the plants respond to the amount of sunlight they have and by whether or not they'll bloom or not. Have you noticed that some plants only bloom, like early in spring? Like here in the U.S. we have like tulips and daffodils and jonquils are plants that are kind of like one of the first ones to pop up in spring, but they don't bloom very long. So when the temperature just barely gets warm enough and there's enough sunlight, they'll bloom, but you won't see them again the rest of the year. And then there's some plants that they won't bloom until late summer. Some of them will only bloom in late fall. There's a mixture between how much light they require to bloom and how warm it is, how warm the soil is particularly. Now, based on something called photochromes, plant pigments that are affected by the amount of light, and that causes the plant to respond in a certain way, particularly like blooming and things like that. So in plants, we will have like long day plants, we'll have short day plants, and then we'll have some plants that it doesn't matter how much light they get. They'll bloom in spring, they'll bloom in summer, they'll bloom in fall. And if you kind of think about it, if you're landscaping, you need a mixture of those. If you plant only spring blooming things, once summer comes, you're not going to have any blossoms, Maybe you just like it that way. But my wife and I like to plant a variety so that at any time of the year, there are some plants that are blooming. Let's start with the short day plants. These are the ones usually that they need, or they will bloom when there's less than 12 hours of sunlight. So those would be like, what times of year would we have probably less than 12 hours of sunlight? Early spring, right? Maybe late fall. So those are the plants that will bloom at that time of year. So you can kind of tell when they bloom as to what light demands they have. So plants that bloom early, or, so some of them, they need it probably more cool when they bloom, and they don't need too much sunlight. If they get too much sunlight, they stop blooming. Doesn't mean the plant dies, it just doesn't bloom anymore during that time. It's okay, it'll grow during that time, but it just won't bloom until the amount of light gets just right. Another one are called long day plants. These are the plants that won't grow until we have many hours of sunlight, more than 12 hours of sunlight. So that's going to be summer. So they'll bloom like late spring all the way through the summer, and then so they won't bloom in early spring, and they won't bloom in fall either. They'll kind of quit when fall comes because there's not enough sunlight to stimulate them to bloom. Then we have some that are day neutral plants. In other words, they will bloom no matter what. If they're healthy, they're getting all the nutrients they need, the temperature is warm enough, they'll bloom. And they'll bloom all the way from spring all the way to fall. We have some plants in our yard that are like that. They'll bloom for a long period of time. Like black-eyed Susans are ones that they need to be, it needs to be pretty warm. So in other words, it's usually about the late spring, early, probably almost summer by the time they start blooming, but then they'll bloom all the way through fall. So I think that one is less dependent on light, but maybe more on temperature. They need to have the ground warm enough, like you would have in summer through fall. And even into fall, the ground still stays warm. Now, the last part we need to talk about in this chapter is about how plants reproduce themselves. There's sexual reproduction. which will involve flowers. There'll be some kind of flowers. It doesn't mean they necessarily have to have petals, but they have to have a lot of the important parts of a flower. And in the process, they'll produce seeds. Now, that doesn't mean that's what necessarily we eat. Sometimes we eat the seeds, sometimes we eat the fleshy part around the seed. We don't eat the seeds. Asexual reproduction is we're producing another organism, another plant in this case, and how will the genetic makeup of the new plant be compared to the original plant? How will they compare if I'm using asexual reproduction? They'll be exactly the same. So if you are trying to maintain certain traits so that every plant is exactly alike, then asexual reproduction is going to be your way that you want to do this. Now, for instance, we have some plants that's the only way you can do it. Like if you have seedless oranges, seedless bananas, you grow those by taking a piece of the plant, and you might have to root it or something like that, but it will produce another plant identical to the original. If the original had no seeds, if the fruit had no seeds, so will these. And we'll talk about another method here in a moment that we will sometimes do to accomplish that. And if you are growing a certain kind of plant, you can speed up the process of getting new plants healthy enough to sell if you do this method, because a large portion of the plant has grown, and all we have to maybe do is grow new roots. We will maybe cut off a piece of the plant, stick it into some potting soil or something like that, and it'll grow new roots. And then, so it doesn't have to go through the whole process of seed sprouting and growing mature enough to get to the point where they're ready to sell. So we can get them sooner, and the guy can make more money, or woman. I guess it doesn't have to be a guy. Now, we do that sometimes with underground parts. We can take the pieces that live underground. For instance, isn't that what we do with like irises and tulips? Tulips, they have bulbs. That's some underground part, and we'll just plant it. And sometimes they have a bunch of these underground parts that you can break apart into smaller pieces, and each one you can plant and have a new plant. So that's what we mean by underground parts. Stems, there's some of you maybe have parents that are really like plants, and they want to have more of it, and they will cut a part of a stem off of a plant and put it into, like I said, like into water or into moist soil, and it'll grow a new set of roots. And then you'll have another plant. It will be identical to the original plant in genes, okay? Or leaves. I can't think of, I've seen it done, but I can't right now think of what kind of leaf it was, but where you can pull or cut a leaf off of some of these plants, and it's just the petiole and the leaf. There's no stem, there's no roots, and you take and put it into like moist soil, and it'll grow new roots, and then soon you'll have a whole plant growing out of that same spot. So you can actually do asexual reproduction from things that were formed underground, that were from a stem, or from the leaves. Now, tissue culturing is where they will cut a piece of the plant. Quite often, I think they do this with trees, and they'll do that where they have the meristematic. Remember, meristematic tissue is the growing part, and it's before it's differentiated, and they can cut that out, and they can do different things. They can either put it in the soil, or sometimes what they'll do is they'll take this little cutting and they'll take it on another plant. They will slit the bark and peel the bark back a little bit, you know, like if you cut your skin and peel the skin back a little bit, and then put this piece of tissue right in the cut, and then pull it back and tie it shut there, and you have meristematic tissue next to meristematic tissue, and it'll just grow into another plant. You know, and it just grows right off the side of another plant. So that's what they mean by tissue culturing. You're taking a piece of tissue where it doesn't have all the parts of the rest of the leaf, doesn't have leaves, doesn't have stem, doesn't have roots. You put it on the side, and then it'll grow into another plant. So the thing that they do with trees, I said I'd talk about it, like those trees that produce fruit that don't have seeds, you know, there's nothing to plant to get another tree. So what I will do is I will cut off the part of the tree, you know, like a branch or a twig off of a tree that produces fruit that has no seeds, and then I'll find another variety of that same plant, maybe that does make seeds, seeded fruit, and I'll cut it. And they have a special little tool. I've watched them actually do this. They'll take this one stem and it cuts it like to a wedge. And then they have the same tool can cut out a wedge out of this one, and they're matching, so they'll slide these two pieces together. So that's the piece that you're keeping of the original plant is called a stalk. The piece you're grafting on is called a scion. And we want the vascular tissue in here to match up with the vascular tissue in there. That makes sense, right? Xylem carries water and nutrients, and it needs to continue on. It can't be blocked, you know. You need to continue on. Sort of like your blood vessels have to line up. Well, it's not quite the same, but that idea. So they'll put them together like that. Then they will typically do something to bind it together so that they don't come apart, and they have a chance to grow into each other. In other words, heal. They actually use the word healing until they have a chance to heal it. And then after it's been there long enough, there will be a little bit of scar tissue around that, like you would expect even on, you know, living things, animals and stuff like that. You have scar tissue. If we were to graft on, you know, well, let's say, for instance, you got your finger cut off and they stitched it back on, there would be scar tissue there, you know, like you'd expect. Well, same thing on a tree where they have been joined together like that. Now, this quite often is going to be a plant that has certain desirable characteristics, but for instance, it produces fruit with seeds. Well, yeah, you know, seeded oranges aren't that great. They're great for maybe squeezing and having a glass of orange juice, but as far as just eating oranges with seeds, you know, most people avoid those. Okay? And then this was the tree that produced oranges, let's say, that has no seeds, but we can't reproduce it. So we graft it on like that. Or if you're buying a tree to grow in your yard, that's quite often what they'll do. They'll take one variety, for instance, that, man, has a great root system, strong stem or trunk, but it has weak branches that tend to break off in ice storms and stuff like that. So we will then find a tree that maybe has great characteristics above ground, but has kind of a measly little root system, you know, that just isn't very strong. And we will cut off the parts we want and put them together. So now I have the good root system of one plant and the other qualities on the other one. Maybe it makes lots of branches with lots of leaves, makes a great shade tree, for instance. But we can do it that way. So a lot of trees you buy in a nursery are that kind, where they've actually taken two varieties and put them together. One has we now have something with both desirable characteristics. Okay, so on to the sexual reproduction part of this. We'll talk about the angiosperms. Remember, those are the ones that flower. And we're going to first talk about what does it mean to have a complete flower. You can wonder, how can you have a part of a flower? No, there's just certain parts are missing because they're not needed. Here's a complete flower. It has sepals. Now, sepals are, if you've ever looked at like a rose, and you look at the backside of the rose, not the part that you always look at, but look at the backside of it where it's attached to the stem. There's they look like little leafy like petals on the backside. Those are called sepals. They were kind of covering up the bud originally, and then when the flower opens up, they kind of peel back and kind of fold down. The petals, obviously, are these, and quite often they are colored because we want to attract those animals, and animals or insects that will help pollinate it. They have at least one stamen. These are the stamens right here, and then one carpel. But birds and insects are attracted to certain flowers because of the beautiful petals that they have. If they're not pollinated by birds and insects, then there's no need for petals, as far as the plant is concerned. We may like them to have petals because we like their beauty, but they're not put on earth necessarily. They're not created that way, let's say it that way, to bring us beauty necessarily. They're made the way they are to make sure that species continues on one generation after the next. So this one has all the parts, so we call it a complete flower. It has showy petals. They often have nectar, so like hummingbirds and butterflies like these kind. We're like here in Nebraska, I think you can buy these bushes that are called butterfly bushes. Butterflies are really attracted to them because of the showy flowers that they have, and they have the nectar, which they like. Hummingbirds like the nectar as well. Then we have those angiosperms that flower, but they don't have the petals. Why do they not have petals? Because they're not fertilized by insects or birds. They require the wind to blow their pollen to other plants. So corn, which we have growing here in Nebraska, is going to be an example of that. This is the male part of the flower, and this part here, the ear of corn, is going to be the female part of the flower. But you don't see any petals. Or you see these hanging down from the trees, and that's the male part of the flower. And these are typically, as I said, pollinated by the wind. The petals would get in the way. They would block the wind from picking up the pollen and blowing it to a flower that needs to be pollinated. So they lack petals. Now, let's talk about this process of pollinating that we talked about. Every flower, whether it's complete or incomplete, needs to have certain parts. You need something that produces the pollen grains. So if this is a normal complete flower that has the petals, you see these little spindly things that grow up on the inside, and if a little gust of wind comes along, they're constantly wiggling around. And on the end of it is where the pollen grains are produced. Okay? That's the male part of the flower. It produces the sperm part. This whole thing is the female part of the flower, and the pollen grains will stick on the end. So at the end of this pistil, we call it, and the end part is called the stigma. It's kind of sticky on the end. So if pollen grains land on it, they don't get blown away. They're stuck. Kind of like has a little bit of glue on the end. It's not glue, but it functions just like glue. It also helps the pollen grain to get started because it needs to do something to help fertilization. So the pollen goes over to there, to the stigma, and So this is the stigma, this is the style, and the part that's down here is the actual ovary where the eggs are produced that will eventually become the seeds once they're fertilized. And then the piece on the inside here where the eggs actually are the ovules, okay? Or the eggs are actually the ovules. Say it that way, it's better. Okay, so what we need to do is when this pollen grain lands on the end of this stigma, the surface is sticky so it won't blow away, but it stimulates that pollen grain to start growing a little tube down, almost like growing a root, but it's actually a tube. It's hollow. And inside the pollen grain were the sperm that are, these little dots right here are supposed to represent the sperm nuclei that came from the male part of the flower. So that's the sperm part. And to get to the ovules, this needs to grow down and inside here to one of those ovules. So it takes a little bit of time for that to grow there. But it's creating a path, like a road, for the sperm nuclei to get all the way to the egg so it can fertilize it. Now, here's an example of some of them that have multiple carpels, they say. This looks like a cross-section through a what? Like a pepper, right? And these are the seeds. Typically, when we eat peppers, we don't eat those, right? We scrape those all out. We just eat the fleshy part around the outside, but we don't eat pepper seeds. At least those pepper seeds, let's say that. You can grind up peppercorns, we call that for black pepper and things like that. It's a little different kind of pepper plants. So pepper plants can come in many different varieties. I didn't even realize there was actually white pepper. I always thought pepper had to be black, but there's actually white pepper. So in this process of fertilizing, the sperm nuclei that make their way down, they each have a job kind of like to do. One of them is going to go to the ovary and unite with an egg and form a diploid zygote, okay? So that's going to be eventually the new little plant that needs to grow. Then we have the other one that unites with another portion of it that already is diploid. So this makes it triploid. In other words, it's 3N. That's the part, this endosperm is the food part of the seed. Like when you pop corn, like popcorn, that white fluffy stuff came from this right here. It's the food part inside of each seed from which this little will eventually grow into a plant, but it will use this as nourishment. And that process there called double fertilization, you fertilize part of it to make the new little plant that will eventually, and part of it to fertilize the part that will become the food for the new plant. Now, remember we talked about seeds before. We had, in the last chapter, we had monocot, dicot. This is corn, and if we slice through the corn and look at it, especially if it's been soaked for a little bit, so it's getting ready to sprout, you can actually see different portions of it that are the embryonic plant inside of here. And this part up here is what they call the cotyledon. Here's the endosperm, that's the food part. And so this is the cotyledon, which will eventually grow into leaves. This part right over here is called the radicle, and it will grow and become the root. So when it sprouts, this is the first part that comes out. And then the hypocotyl is the piece in between that will become the stem. So you can actually see the individual parts that will be the whole plant. So we have the roots, the stem, and the leaves, but just a little tiny embryonic plant inside of there. This would be like a bean. When you pop a bean in half, here's the little embryonic plant. Okay, it has the apical again, that's going to become the leaves. This part in between here and there is going to be the stem, and this is the part that will come out, grow in the ground, and become the first root that you see when the bean sprouts. So here is, let's say, a bean plant, or bean seed, I'm sorry. It's moist enough and it's starting to sprout. The first thing to come out was that radicle that I told you about. The radicle is the first part that grows out, and it's going to become the root. Shortly thereafter, this will start growing in here, and it will eventually become part of the stem, and then coming out of here also will be that epicotyl that will become the leaves. And when it's this size, you can kind of see all the individual parts. You can see the root. You can see that came from the radicle, the stem that came from the hypocotyl, and the epicotyl that became the leaves. And here are the two halves of the seed that are nourishing this young plant until its roots can get enough nutrients and its leaves can generate enough food for the plant to live on its own. So as that's happening, it's using up nutrients inside of here, and eventually these will dry up and fall off. Otherwise, I think you're dead. Okay, so what are conditions that are necessary for germination? Well, obviously have to have enough moisture, right? Do farmers plant their crops in the middle of winter? No, they wait until the soil's warm enough. So they probably, if they're really going to be timing it perfectly, they're probably going out and measuring the temperature of the soil. So when the soil gets to a certain temperature, now it's time to go plant our seeds. Hopefully we'll get the rains in the right time so that the seeds will sprout. Now sometimes they talk about planting their seeds in just dry soil. The soil's warm enough, all we need is water. So I'm not going to I'm just going to put seeds in the dry soil, wait for it to rain, then they'll germinate. Otherwise, normally when they put it in there, the ground is wet, it's already warm enough, and it won't be long, maybe in a week, it'll start peeking up above the ground. That's what you're hoping will happen. So temperature is kind of critical there. So if it's too cold, it won't sprout for usually most crops. Now, at this time of year, you can still find some weeds that will sprout. There's some weeds that will sprout when the ground is almost frozen. That's their ideal time. Right? And obviously they need oxygen. Okay? If you have the soil too wet, it's like what happens if you have the roots in too much water. They drown. Have you noticed that around Bellevue here where farmers plant, particularly like bean, well, I guess you can see it both with beans and corn, that you have some parts of the field that have nothing growing. Well, probably when they planted the seeds, we got some rains and it flooded that area, and the soil was too soggy, and there wasn't enough oxygen. Yeah, there's enough moisture for the seeds to sprout, but not enough oxygen to let them continue to grow, and they probably just drowned and died. And so there's no crop there. So that's the reason why they're careful to drain water away from an area if you want it to grow. Now, once the plant is up, it's amazing how much more water they can tolerate, because they're constantly drawing water out of the soil and helping to dry it out. Now, when the ovary begins to, the seeds have been fertilized and the ovary matures, then you'll see this fleshy stuff around the outside, and that's going to be the fruit that you're going to eat.